And welcome back, and we are moving into our first segment for the morning. As a matter of fact, like we mentioned to you earlier, we've got representatives in from the Statistical Institute of Belize. We'll be chit-chatting a little bit about World Statistics Day coming up. And for this year in Belize, we'll be celebrating under the theme, Building the Resiliency of the Caribbean Community. We got that, right?
Yes.
Excellent. Now in with us is actually Diana Castillo-Trejo, who is the Deputy Director General at the Statistical Institute of Belize. Good morning.
Good morning.
And Jefte Ochaeta, I like that. Statistician 1, Economic Statistic Department. Guys, good morning.
Good morning.
It's so nice to have you, and welcome.
Thank you for having us.
I want to start by, because it comes to mind statistics. Why is that important? Why have statistics? Why even celebrate the day? Let's start there.
Well, Statistics Day is the day that's designated to kind of highlight the importance of the work that we do. Mm-hmm. And what we do is we provide information to measure everything that happens in daily life. It tells us about how we live, about who our population is, the conditions that we live under, the type of economic conditions that we're looking at or that we're facing. And it also gives us direction in terms of how we can change things for the better in our country, what it is that we need to work on, what we need to improve. It gives us a way to measure that and to know, what direction we're going in.
There is a global commemoration and also a local one. And the theme this year is more geared towards looking at the region. What does that mean in terms of the collaboration between the Statistical Institute of Belize and other similar institutes in the Caribbean?
Okay, well, we are a part of a regional body of other statistical agencies just like ours in the Caribbean, and we jointly celebrate Statistics Day every year, Caribbean Statistics Day, and we focus on a particular theme that is of particular relevance to the region. Mm-hmm. We as statistical agencies work closely together. We develop harmonized work plans, we develop common goals. We work on, building capacity together as a region. And so, we build together, we help each other out, where some of us have strengths and others might need help. Yeah. We help each other out. So we work very closely with our counterparts in the region.
Yeah. Undoubtedly, numbers are important. But we're not all numbers people. And so I know a part of the work at the Statistical Institute of Belize, it's not just collecting the data, but then you have to disseminate it to the public as well. Let's talk about that process in making the information accessible and accessible to all.
It is harder than you can imagine to do that because we find that most people don't like dealing with numbers. And we've done a lot of work to kind of try and get our information out to the public, to make it more relevant, easier to understand. And I still think that we have a lot more, that we can do, or a lot more further to go with that. But we've done, work to make our website, for example, much more user-friendly than it was a few years ago. Information is very accessible and easy to find there. We do our monthly publications where, as technical as they might seem, we really try to simplify as much as possible to kind of make these themes and these issues easier to understand. On our website, we also have a section where we have very, very simple, user-friendly types of publications like infographics, posters, that you could just download an image or a graphic and kind of get the picture of a particular statistic that we're publishing. So we've done a lot of work on it, and I know we still have a lot more to do.
Belizeans would say, things have not been looking up the way that we would expect it to. We hear all the propaganda of how the economy is and what we have to do now to live on a daily basis. Yeah. But yet we're mentioning here how easy it is to get the data, or for Belizeans to actually see the data. How's that traffic for you? And what are the most commonly asked questions about from Belizeans in terms of statistics in Belize?
Most of the queries we get pertain to population. After that, then it's queries about the growth of the economy and on inflation. Inflation is one of our key statistics, is one that it's kind of difficult to understand sometimes, and one of the most frequent feedback that we get from our users is that they feel that there's a disconnect between the numbers that we produce and the perception that the public has of their day-to-day life and economic conditions.
How do you explain that? Why is it that the numbers produced by SIB doesn't feel like the reality on the ground?
Well, for one thing, the figures that we produce pertain to the entire country. So from the outset, you're starting out with an average. For example, when it comes to the inflation rate, you're looking at the average movement of prices over time. Another thing is to remember that stable prices or relatively stable prices don't necessarily equate to a low cost of living. You can have high prices that are not very volatile, but your cost of living is still high. One of the misconceptions is that a flat inflation rate or a stable inflation rate means that we're saying that the cost of living is low, when in fact, that the two are not necessarily correlated. Another thing is, again, you're looking at an overall average. So with the inflation rate, it's somewhere around 1%, the last one that we published. But hidden beneath that average, you have some spikes and you have some drops. And what happens is that, what goes up tends to offset what goes down. So if you look at the subcategories, fuel is always identified as a category of good that is very volatile. It spikes and then it will tend to fall, and it spikes again.
Yeah.
But something like house rent, which we spend a big chunk of our household budget on, tends to be very stable. It doesn't, your rent doesn't increase 10% every year, for example. It tends to be very stable.
But as you said before,
not necessarily low, right?
Yeah. Right. I think that's what got me for the feast, no?
Yeah.
And I think this is a great opportunity to talk about some of the data that is available, because we do really look to the Statistical Institute for a lot of the population stuff, some of the household survey information, but you do quite a range of data collection individually and in partnership. Tell us about some of the things that are accessible at SIB.
Well, right now, our core products that we maintain, like Ms. Diana has already mentioned, is basically we look at the population studies. So we know every year we would produce mid-year estimates of the population by district and urban rural locations of the country. So that indicates the projection of how fast the population is growing and each area how much people is located. And then we have our also socioeconomic indicators, where we study the labor market of the country. So the employment and unemployment rates, which are of great importance and interest. The latest labor force survey was done in April of this year, and we reported, based on that study, that the unemployment rate is about 9.4%. And then we have the countrywide. Then we have the economic statistics that we normally produce, like the gross domestic product, which measures the entire production of services and goods in the economy. And for the second quarter of 2018, we reported a GDP of 5.4% increase to the second quarter of 2017. Also, we have the inflation, as Ms. Dana already mentioned. In August of 2018, our latest inflation rate is of 1%. Then we also measure the international merchandise trade, which happens between Belize and the rest of the world. In August, our imports totaled about $172.5 million, and our exports totaled about $22.9 million. So those are basically the core statistics that the organization produces.
Yeah.
But we're also involved in several other products. For instance, we're right now doing our third round. We're going to start our third round of the household budget survey, which basically is the base study that helps us to build the basket of goods and services that is utilized to measure the inflation of the country. So right now in October 29th, we will start that survey again in the entire country. Also, we are preparing in the week of the 24th of October to do a study on national domestic tourism. So we're piloting a study for national domestic tourism that we expect to send our people as a full survey in February of next year.
Yeah.
So that's some of the
interesting.
interesting things that we're working on right now. Yeah.
Now, I'd imagine that one of the challenges of a national data collecting agency that you are perhaps continuously questioned about the autonomy of the data that you get. In other words, if the data is provided by the departments or government ministries or agencies that you are reporting about, how do you trust what is coming in?
Well, the data doesn't only come from government departments. That's one of our sources. But we also do verification where we can with other sources. So, for example, we receive a lot of data from the private sector. We cross-check that with administrative data that we receive from government. So we get from as many sources as possible and try to keep the quality of the data as good as possible. We are continuously engaging with the data providers and continuously looking for new sources of data. And one of the things that we are actually very fortunate is that we do have a lot of autonomy in the way that we conduct our work, meaning that although the SIB is funded by government, we are able to determine our own methodologies, how we do our surveys, how we analyze our data, when we will publish, what we say when we publish. So we have a great deal of autonomy, and that's very important for an office that does national statistics.
Of course,
How strong is the network of data providers? Because your data will only be as good as how an individual agency collects their data. It's improving. It's improving. We have some good sources of data, and over the past few years, we've built up some very good relationships with the private sector. We strengthened the relationships with the private sector, and we continuously, go out and try to build new relationships with new data providers. At this time, our economic statistics department is working on a project for the improvement of the GDP estimates. And in doing that, they are out looking for new sources, trying to measure sectors of the economy that probably weren't even there 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when our GDP model was developed, and coming out of this in a few years' time, we're going to have an entirely new and improved GDP model that includes data from all these different sources that we haven't been working with before, includes data on sectors that we weren't even measuring a few years ago.
One of the things that stick out to me, and of course to Marlene, is the fact that Jefte mentioned that starting soon is actually data on domestic tourism, which I am really anxious to see what that data is going to be like. Another very interesting thing for me is the growth of the population, because we've seen an influx of folks coming from other countries, and then getting that being Belizean because they got here over a period of time. Now, how important is that to the economy? And I stress this because we know that if you've got a certain amount of people in a country, then the economy is either up here or down here. Talk to us about that particular.
Well, the population growth in an economy is very important, because then it means that you have more consumers, right? So that means that from your supply side, you should increase your productivity, because you have to provide more to the consumers. So when a population grows, it's positive. It means that the economy should also grow in par, right? Because in the economy, we measure it as a supply and use side. So this should be balanced. You cannot have more consumption than what you supply. So the economy should grow in correlation with the population growth.
In terms of the growth of the population, where do we see the largest or the smallest growth?
The by the district,
By
you mean?
district.
The districts, normally the population growth we are observing in our model is here in Belize district and Cayo district.
San Pedro and Belmopan are the two fastest growing communities in the country.
San
Yeah.
Pedro and Belmopan.
Yes.
Wow.
And it doesn't
Yes.
mean an influx of new people. It could be movement, displacement
Yes.
as well,
Yes.
right? Yeah.
Migration.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
if I
Internal
move from
migration.
Belize City to San Pedro,
Yeah.
that's one down Belize City, one up San
Right,
Pedro.
exactly.
Very literal terms.
Yeah.
But that's fascinating information. And actually, I wanted to ask you that because I'm sure in your work you perhaps uncover some very interesting facts that you wish people would go to the website and read and find out and understand, or even correct misconceptions. Like I can never forget a previous conversation where one person said, listen, we've never had 2-to-1 female to male, it's 50-50. And we still hear it. But tell me some of the interesting information that you've uncovered, whether recently or over the years, that you think Belizeans would really benefit from in going to find on the website.
Well, I mean, that's a big one, and we still get asked that. Our population is basically 50-50. It can vary by district or by community depending on the type of economic activity that takes place there. So if you have a community that's heavily agricultural, you might have slightly more males and females, and in the urban areas you might have a little more females, but on average it's 50-50. Another thing to note is that the growth of our population, or at least birth rates, have been slowing down over time.
Wow.
So normally when we do the census, there's a graphic done, the population pyramid, where you break the population down by age groups, and normally the base of your population is your youngest part of the population, and as gets older, they are supported by the younger ones who join the working age population. But what we found is that birth rates have been slowing down a bit, so that this last census that we did, the very base of our population was actually narrower than the age groups that were slightly ahead of it, meaning that in a few years' time we might have more people being supported by a smaller working age population. And here is where something like migration, might change that. If persons who migrate in have different birth rates than our native population, that could change that
difference in the
dynamic.
age group? So your lowest
It
cohort
would be the lowest, I think, is 0 to 5. So that was the babies in 2010. And if that trend continues, then when we do our next census in 2020, we might see a further narrowing of the base. Now that depends on what has happened with migration or with birth rates. What we know is that, for example, as females become more educated, birth rates tend to decline. And we know that our females are attending tertiary education at a rate, at a rate of 2-to-1. Compared to males, so females are getting more educated, and so it just follows that we might expect a decline or a further decline in birth rates among females. So the dynamic of that is going to depend on what happens with migration over the past 10 years. We'll find that out in the next census, or what has happened in terms of birth rates with our own females in Belize.
Yeah. Jefte,
Very
what stands
interesting.
out for you? That was a really
Well,
interesting. Actually, Canada and China have seen, and
Yes.
some of the more developed countries have seen this problem with a smaller young population.
Yes, and
Yeah.
a lot of these countries there are putting in place incentives to encourage migration because, down the line, their working age population will be much smaller than the dependent population.
Yeah, well, basically what Ms. Diana mentioned, that's something that I have an interest in demographics of the country. But something that I've always find fascinating from the data is our merchandise trade and how our imports and exports work. Sometimes when we look at the import data and the export data, domestic exports, we say, okay, it's a huge gap. But when we really look at everything, we need to add something that's called re-exports, because imports that come into the free zone are exported to Mexico or Guatemala, but they are not categorized as domestic exports. These are categorized as re-exports. So when we add this into the total, we get total exports, and this narrows the gap between imports and exports. So that's something that has come to me, because it helps me understand where we might be falling short, because not
there's a big difference
exactly
than we produce it and export it than bring it in and export.
exactly.
That's
And that contributes a lot to the economy, because it's part of a big sector called the merchandise trade. Yeah.
Another point to add to what Jefte said is that we don't do all our trade only in goods. So when we think about exports, we think about our traditional goods that we export, like our agricultural products and so on. But we do a lot of trade in services. Tourism, for example, is a big source of income where we don't physically export a good, but there is income coming in. So, the bigger picture has to do, yes, in terms of goods traded, there's a big deficit, but there is also, services that we export that brings in income that kind of, it would be absolutely unsustainable in the long term if we were just, trading in goods at that rate.
And everything revolves around the economic measure. So the trading services, maybe we are not measuring yet at the SIB, but it's already tackled by another institution. They have an estimate for trading services. So when we take our measures at the economic level, we include trading services. So that gives us a better picture, right, of the deficit between the imports and total exports. So another thing that we have found interesting in the years I've been working at SIB is trying to understand the actual activity happening in the informal sector of the country.
What is the informal sector?
Well, businesses that are not really formalized, that are not registered with a tax authority, and that do not maintain audited reports and stuff like that. So that sector, even though it's not really measured right now in our economy, we are seeing in the revision of our model that is going to have a huge impact in our revised estimates. So that's something that I am very interested in trying to sort of massage and have a better measure of that sector, because it's predominant in our country.
But how do you collect that data if the authorities can't even get them to report?
Well, that's why we would do surveys and also rely not only on tax authorities, we'd rely on other institutions like the municipalities. The municipalities, it's interesting because I have been working with them for some years. You get a registration, a trade license, that's for the establishment, but they also have a trade license for peddlers, so like street vendors. So those kinds of things that are allowed and that are registered, being a street vendor, as a peddler, is something that helps us to identify, the amount of peddlers in a municipality can give us an indication of the amount of informality happening in the country.
Interesting.
I knew there were some that stuck out to you. Can we dive a bit into the demographic discussion? Because I've always found it interesting. It's self-reporting. When we talk about ethnicities, or we talk about some people call it culture that they subscribe to. Let's talk about what the breakdown is for Belize at a time, because anyone who looks around can see that we're seeing a shift in our demographics due to migration. Tell us what the current data says.
Well, more than half of our population now is of mestizo ethnicity, and that has been a shift for over the past decades. And a lot of that, as you said, has been due to migration.
They report mestizo, right?
They report mestizo.
Yeah, so it's because mestizo is an ethnicity that we use in Belize, but not necessarily in Central America.
Yes. I think the way that the category is in the census questionnaire is mestizo / Hispanic. So, but yes, people do self-identify. So if a person identifies themselves as being Creole, of Creole ethnicity, then that's how they would be recorded. We don't really have any way of verifying that.
Yeah.
So we go by what people report. But it's been pretty consistent,
Okay.
and consistent with what we see in terms of migration trends, where the mestizo population has been growing. Along with that, the portion of our population that reports that Spanish is their first language also has been growing. And then following that, well, the Creole is the second biggest ethnic group. I think it might be around 1/3. Then we have the Garifunas. The Mayas are about maybe 12%, 10-12%. And then you have other smaller ethnic groups. We are very, very diverse.
Yeah.
So those who reported Spanish as first language is how much?
I don't know offhand.
Yeah.
It would be not a whole 50%, but it's very
Pretty close.
close.
Yes.
And a lot of our population, of course, reports that they speak multiple languages. So they would report English, Spanish, and
Other.
Creole. Some report Creole as a separate language as well.
Is there any attempt in the future to kind of differentiate between people who have migrated to the country versus those
Well, the information is already available in our census because we collect the country of origin,
who...
Oh.
right? So in our census questionnaire, we ask where you were born. So if you were born in Guatemala, that means you migrated to Belize,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
So the
So it's
information
there.
is available for anyone to do the queries if they want.
And I'm really grateful that you said that because
Yeah.
that is another question I wanted to get at, which is the Statistical Institute of Belize is a data collection agency, which means you collect the information
Exactly.
and you put it out in the most simplistic form. But research, the understanding, the why, the how, needs to be done by another entity.
Yes.
What are you seeing from your end in terms of interests by universities or schools or NGOs in seeking out the data to understand more?
There is a lot of interest from international researchers that work with the international agencies. So at the SIB, we have a program that's called the Microdata Access Program, where researchers, they can apply to access an entire data set. It's anonymized, so we take out all the identifying information and any variables that might be too unique that can identify a person.
Okay.
But a researcher can come in, they can work with the data, they can run whatever tables they want, and they can do their analysis. Now, we work with a lot of international researchers, but local researchers, the demand hasn't really been there. And from what we are gathering in our interaction with agencies in the national statistical system, a part of it has to do with the capacity to work with the data. A lot of work has to be done to continue building capacity to even work with statistical softwares to be able to do that kind of analysis on the numbers.
Yeah.
Yes, we have local researchers who would contact us and request particular tables, but in terms of coming in and actually digging into the data, we still have to build some capacity there, or at least build more awareness of that facility being available.
Yeah, very interesting, the data that we've been diving into. One of the things, because the last time SIB was here, it was when we were going to start something else. I think some other data. But are we, in terms of how off we are in terms of the specific number when we talk about the data, and then for people accepting those who are doing the data into the homes, how are we seeing that going on? Are we seeing more interaction from the public to the workers?
In terms of our household surveys, we have always maintained a very good relationship with our household respondents, meaning that our response rates for households are actually quite high. Now, the survey that we are doing right now, the household budget survey, is a particularly difficult one.
Because you want to know how we're spending our money.
Yes.
down to the last dollar. And it's important, and I understand that households or respondents might feel that it's kind of invasive, but it's important because that feeds into our understanding and our estimates of, for example, inflation rates. If we don't get good information and accurate information on how households spend their budget, then we're not able to provide back to the public a relevant inflation rate, meaning that we will take the information that we get there and we'll put together the most common set of goods and services. And then those are the things that we are going to measure over the next 5 years, 8 years. Every month we'll go and measure the prices for those things, and then we track how they move over time. But if we don't get relevant information on how people are spending their money, that affects the quality.
So if you're spending 3/4 of your salary on food, you need to know that, or tuition, or rent. You know, we really need people. We need to know that from everybody across the board.
Exactly.
Yes.
Because, like Ms. Diana mentioned, it's for the creation of the basket to measure the inflation, and also it's also part of the consumption that I was talking about earlier of the economy. You need to know what's your consumption. If the survey doesn't provide the confidence from the respondents to us, then that means we can really have a good estimate on the consumption side of the economy. And then it all comes to not what we produce, to what people give us.
Wow. Interesting day today, I have got to say that. But building the resiliency of the Caribbean community, we're celebrating under that theme. October 20th is the day for World Statistics Day. Now tell us about activities leading up to. What are we doing leading up to this particular day?
Okay, normally what the SIB would do is we would hold an exhibition or some kind of event for Statistics Day, and that would be the activity we do in October. This year we have a number of activities that are going on, so we're not doing a particular exhibition this year, but we have activities going on throughout the month of October. So earlier this month we held a capacity building workshop with producers of environmental statistics. We're working with them on a project funded by the UNDP to build capacity and to kind of standardize how environmental statistics are done, and to kind of consolidate all these different sources into being able to produce the environmental statistics we need to report every year. So we've been working with them all year, and we just held a workshop with them earlier this month. Later this month, or at the end of the month, we're going to be doing the official launch of the census, and all our energy and all our staff are kind of focused on preparing for that right now. So that's going to be on the 31st of this month at the Radisson. And that is basically our kickoff to our public awareness campaign and the intensification of all our preparatory activities. So we've been preparing for 2 years, but this, starting here at the launch is when we are all focused on census for the next couple of years. So that's a big one that's coming up this month. And then at the start of November, we'll be doing an event jointly with UB and the IDB to launch a bachelor's degree in statistics program and a certificate in GIS that we worked along with UB and the IDB to develop this program. It's a part of our National Statistical System project that we have been working on the past couple of years. So we worked with them to develop a statistics program specifically for persons who work in our field, but who may not have had that formal training. So it's for public service persons who work in the field of statistics. The classes are in the evening, on the weekends. It's very accommodating to persons who work. And so we'll be doing an event in the beginning of November to officially launch this and promote that particular project. So we have a very busy month, and our staff is small, but we are doing a whole lot for this month and for Statistics Day in general.
Now, before we close, I think, I want to give you the opportunity because, like, as we said in the very beginning, people, not everyone is a numbers person. In fact, very few people are numbers people. But they do matter. And what would you say to the general public as to why they should pay attention to the indicators as they're presented, after they've been compiled and presented, and the impact it has directly on them? What do you say to them?
Well, I would encourage, first of all, our respondents in the public and even in the business sector, that when we reach out to you to get data, it's always with a purpose. So all the information we collect is for building up this bigger picture about our country. it really tells us where we are, what is the state that we're living in, what are the areas that we need to improve. And the better information that we get from the public and the better indicators we can produce, the better our decision makers and even we, you know, as private citizens can make decisions about, you know, how we use our resources, what we put our money into, what are the areas of need that we need to address. So the more information we have, the more informed decisions can be made, especially when it comes to allocating resources on the part of the government. You know, resources are very limited and there are so many areas of need, but knowing what areas, you know, need to be targeted based on information, not just on perception, is very important, because proper targeting of resources, proper decision making based on information, it really goes a long way in terms of making the outcome of those decisions successful. And when it comes to, you know, allocating government resources, that has implications for the development of the entire country.
It's very important, as Ms. Diana mentioned, because, for instance, business people need to know the demographics of the country to have a better campaign of their market, of their products. But if they do not utilize the information that we produce, then they are basically guiding themselves blindly and doing these approaches to their marketing or to selling their products. But if they know and utilize the data, then they can have a better impact in their business process model.
That's a good pitch, Jefte.
And
We all need
lastly,
each other.
what's your website so people can keep on getting this information? What's the website?
The website is www.sib.org.bz. So that's we're in the World Wide Web, and then you can get access to our data. We have different information there.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you very much too.
All right, we're going to go ahead and take a break. When we come back, we will be talking to the Kidney Association of Belize, so stay tuned.